I knew the Homeowners Association could be a pain, but I never expected a middle-aged suburban tyrant to declare war over the color of my house. It started with a letter. A crisp white envelope tucked into my mailbox, the HOA's logo stamped. At the top, like an official government decree. The words were polite, but the meaning was clear. Your house is an eyesore. Repainted immediately. I had lived in Silver Pines for 5 years. It was a cookie-cutter neighborhood. Manicured lawns, identical mailboxes, and an unspoken rule that no one should stand out too much. But I liked my house. A deep slate blue with white trim. Classic. Sharp. Apparently, not up to code. That's when she got involved. Barbara Whitmore, HOA president, self-appointed guardian of the Silver Pines aesthetic, a woman who had built an empire on bylaws and fines. She was in her early 50s but carried herself like a queen, always in neatly pressed capris, a floral blouse, buttoned up to her throat, and a permanent smirk that screamed, "I know what's best for you." She showed up on my porch the day after I got the letter. I had barely opened the door when she bulldozed inside, holding a clipboard like it was a weapon. "We need to talk about your house, Daniel." I hated how she said my name. Slow, patronizing, like I was a misbehaving child. I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms. "Sure, Barbara." "What's the problem?" She sighed dramatically, flipping through her clipboard. "Silver Pines has a very deliberate color palette. We strive for a harmonious streetscape. Your house," she gestured at it like it was a pile of garbage, "disrupts that harmony." I glanced at my house, then at the others on the street. Beige, off-white, light gray, bland, lifeless shades that made the neighborhood look like a row of upscale tombstones. "It's just blue," I said. "Not neon, not graffiti, just blue." Barbara smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made my stomach twist. "Well, the board disagrees. You have 2 weeks to comply." And just like that, she turned and strutted down my driveway, already dialing someone on her phone. I could imagine the conversation. "We've got a non-compliant homeowner. I'll handle it." I wasn't about to roll over. I poured through the HOA bylaws, hoping to find some loophole, but they were airtight. Of course they were. I needed something bigger. Something that wouldn't just defy Barbara, but humiliate her. Then it hit me. She wanted my house to blend in? Fine, I'd make it disappear. I reached out to an artist I knew, a guy named Lucas, a local painter who specialized in optical illusions. The idea made him laugh so hard he nearly choked. Wait, you want me to camouflage your house?" Exactly. Lucas was in. Over the next few days, we designed a pattern that would make my house visually merge into its surroundings. A blend of muted greens, grays, and shadowed edges, designed to trick the eye. From certain angles, my house would almost vanish. The Crown project began quietly, but as the paintwork took shape, people noticed. Neighbors paused during their morning jogs. Delivery drivers stopped to take pictures. Kids pointed, wide-eyed. Someone posted a photo on Facebook, and within a day, the post had thousands of likes. Barbara noticed, too. I caught her standing on the sidewalk, jaw clenched so tight I thought her teeth might crack. She stormed up my driveway the next morning, slamming her clipboard against her palm. "This is a direct violation of HOA regulations," she shrieked. I grinned. "Actually, it's not. You said my house needed to blend in. Now it does." Her face turned an impressive shade of red. "You know exactly what you're doing. This is mockery." "Mockery?" I feigned surprise. "No, Barbara, I'm just embracing the Silver Pines aesthetic." She fumed, she seethed, and then she stomped away, muttering about escalating matters. That's when things got weird. First came the fines. A new notice in my mailbox every day. One for unauthorized modification of exterior paint. Another for attracting unwanted attention to the neighborhood. Hundreds of dollars in bogus violations. Then the harassment. Barbara began patrolling my street like a shark, glaring at tourists who stopped to take pictures. She even confronted a couple of teenagers, demanding they delete the photos off their phones. But the final straw? She started clamping cars. I came home one evening to find 3 vehicles locked down with bright yellow wheel clamps. A handwritten note was taped to my mailbox. Unauthorized street parking is subject to fines. Removal fee, $200 per vehicle, pay at HOA office. I could hardly believe it. She was holding cars hostage. That night I stood on my porch, looking at my not quite invisible house. The war had begun, and Barbara had just overplayed her hand. I had no idea how far she was willing to go, but I was about to find out. The next morning I woke up to silence, the kind that makes your skin prickle, like the world is holding its breath. I stepped outside, and that's when I saw it. My house was gone. Not literally, of course. The structure was still there, but someone, Barbara, obviously, had covered it with a massive white tarp. A building-sized burial shroud, draped from the roof to the ground, completely obscuring the camouflage. Stapled to the tarp, dead center, was a bright red sign. This property is under HOA review. Non-compliance will not be tolerated. I heard my neighbor, Mrs. Patel, gasp from her front yard. A jogger slowed to a stop, taking out his phone to snap a picture. Barbara was standing at the end of my driveway, clipboard in hand, her eyes practically glowing with satisfaction. "Problem, Daniel?" she called out sweetly. I clenched my fists. "What the hell is this?" "A temporary measure." She tilted her head, all mock innocence. "Until you correct the violation." I ripped the sign off and let it drop to the ground. "You covered my house with a tarp." She smiled, unbothered. "Well, since you insist on circumventing the guidelines, the board felt this was necessary. We wouldn't want any more unauthorized visitors, would we?" I glanced at the street. Sure enough, Barbara's plan was working. People who had come to see the optical illusion were already driving away. "You can't just do this," I snapped. She let out a little laugh. "Oh, but I can." Section 4.2b of the HOA regulations states that properties deemed to be in ongoing violation can be covered to protect neighborhood integrity until compliance is met. You should really read the fine print. I took a step toward her, lowering my voice. "Barbara, take it down." She arched an eyebrow. "Or what?" I didn't have an answer. Not yet. But I would. For now I had no choice but to watch her stroll away, smug as ever. By midday, news of the tarp had spread. People were furious. Not just my friends, but other neighbors. People who had never openly spoken out against Barbara before. I overheard conversations on the sidewalk. "She's lost her mind. She's making us look like lunatics. This isn't a neighborhood anymore. It's a dictatorship." I wasn't the only one who had had enough. That night, I cut the tarp down. I worked fast, slicing through the industrial staples with a pocket knife. The heavy material collapsed in sections, revealing the camouflage once again. It was a small victory, but a satisfying one. By morning, Barbara had retaliated. She had installed security cameras. Not on my property, she couldn't do that, but on the street. One directly across from my house. Another near the entrance to the cul-de-sac. I wasn't just a rule breaker now, I was a threat, and she was watching me. A few days passed, and the situation worsened. The HOA fines kept piling up. The letters grew more aggressive, each one worded like a threat. Then came the new rule. Visitors must register with the HOA prior to entry. Barbara had turned the entire neighborhood into a gated community, except there was no actual gate. Just a clipboard-toting tyrant who had appointed herself Border Patrol. She set up checkpoints. She planted a lawn chair near the entrance and started stopping cars. If a driver couldn't prove they lived in Silver Pines, she demanded they fill out a visitor's form. If they refused, she ordered them to turn around. And somehow, the HOA board was letting her get away with it. I needed an advantage. I started digging. I called the county office to check permit records. If Barbara had installed those security cameras on public property without permission, I could fight back. No dice. I went through the HOA's financial disclosures to see if she had used HOA funds for personal expenses. If I could prove she was mismanaging money, she'd be removed. Nothing there either. But then, late one night, I found something. A document buried deep in the neighborhood's original founding charter. A clause Barbara must have overlooked. And it changed everything. Read it again, my heart pounding. Because if I was right, If this was still legally binding, Barbara wasn't just overstepping her authority. She had never had it in the first place. The document was old, dating back to when Silver Pines was first developed. A founding charter outlining the original structure of the HOA. Most of it was legal jargon. Who held power, what rights the homeowners had, how the board could operate. But buried deep within, in faded ink and archaic language, was a clause that changed everything. The HOA's authority wasn't permanent. It had a built-in expiration date, and that expiration date had passed 2 years ago. I sat back in my chair, my mind racing. Barbara wasn't just abusing power. She was ruling over an HOA that technically no longer existed, and she had no idea. I should have felt victorious, but I knew better. If I went after her now, she'd fight tooth and nail. She'd lawyer up. She'd twist the board into backing her. No. I needed to make her destroy herself. I needed to push her until she snapped. The next morning, I took a different approach. I smiled at Barbara when I walked outside and saw her glaring at me from across the street, clipboard in hand. I waved. Her eyes narrowed. She expected resistance, defiance. She wasn't prepared for calm. I let her think she was winning. I even played along. I paid one of her ridiculous fines, just one, enough to make her think I was cracking, and it worked. Barbara's confidence swelled. The next day, she escalated again. I came home to find a chain-link fence around my property, an actual locked fence, with another sign, restricted area, HOA board in review. She had taken it too far, way too far. Even the most passive neighbors were starting to murmur. Barbara had always been a control freak, but this was insanity, and she was doubling down. I watched from my porch as she patrolled Silver Pines like a self-appointed sheriff, clipboard clutched to her chest like a badge. She screamed at a group of teenagers for riding their bikes too close to the visitor checkpoint. She scolded Mrs. Patel's son for playing basketball in his own driveway. She even tried to fine an elderly couple for having a garden gnome that wasn't architecturally cohesive. People were getting fed up. And that's when I made my next move. I called the county zoning office. I reported Barbara's checkpoints, the roadblocks, the illegal visitor logs. Then I made another call, this time to the local news. Barbara had wanted attention. She was about to get it. The first news crew arrived that evening. I saw the van pull up, the reporters stepping out with a cameraman in tow. They were here to do a local interest piece, something light, something ridiculous. They wanted to film my camouflage house. Barbara was not having it. She stormed down the street, practically foaming at the mouth. "You need to leave," she hissed at the reporter. The reporter, a sharp-eyed woman with a practiced smile, held up her microphone. "Ma'am, are you saying the press isn't allowed in Silver Pines?" "This is private property." The reporter gestured at the public street. "This?" Barbara's lips twitched. "Are you the HOA president?" the reporter asked. Barbara puffed up. "Yes, and I am responsible for maintaining order in this community." "Order?" The reporter's eyes flicked to my property. "Do you think locking a homeowner's property behind a fence is maintaining order?" Barbara's jaw clenched. "It's necessary." "For what?" Barbara hesitated, and in that hesitation, I saw cracks. She hadn't expected pushback. The reporter sensed it too. She leaned in, pressing. "Some residents are saying your enforcement of HOA rules has been extreme. Do you think your leadership has been fair?" Barbara snapped. "You think this is extreme?" she shouted. "You think I'm the problem? I'm the only thing keeping this place from turning into a complete disaster. If I let people like him," she stabbed a finger toward me, "get away with their nonsense, this neighborhood falls apart." The cameraman was still rolling. I folded my arms. "People like me?" She turned on me. "You think this is funny? You think this is some game?" The reporter jumped on it. "So this is personal?" Barbara froze. I watched the gears turn in her head. She had said too much. She had lost control. I met her gaze and, for the first time, I saw something new behind the anger, fear, because she knew she had just made the biggest mistake of her life, and I wasn't done yet. The next morning, the news clip was everywhere: social media, the local paper, even the HOA's own Facebook group was flooded with comments. "She's out of control. She's embarrassing us. Can we vote her out?" Barbara tried to do damage control. She issued a formal statement on the HOA website. But the real blow came when the county office responded. The visitor checkpoints, the wheel clamps, the fines, completely illegal. Barbara got a letter from the zoning board. She had 48 hours to remove the fences, cancel the visitor logs, and stop issuing citations, or face legal action. The board was panicking, and I knew they were about to turn on her. But I wasn't finished yet, because I still had my trump card, the charter. And when I revealed it, Barbara wouldn't just lose power. She'd lose everything. Barbara had no idea what was coming. For years she had built herself into an untouchable force, ruling Silver Pines like a queen with a clipboard. But every kingdom eventually falls, and I was about to drop the guillotine. The HOA meeting that night was packed. More people than I'd ever seen at one of these useless gatherings, neighbors who had never attended before, now eager to watch the fire. Barbara sat at the head of the long table flanked by the remaining board members. Her jaw was tight, her shoulders stiff. She was trying to look in control, but I saw the truth. She was crumbling. The news coverage, the backlash, the county's warning. Her iron grip on Silver Pines was slipping, and she knew it. I waited. Let her squirm. Then, as the meeting was called to order, I stood up. "I'd like to bring something to the board's attention," I said, voice even. Barbara folded her arms. "You can file a formal complaint." "Oh, I have something better." I held up the document. The founding charter. The yellowed pages rippled under the fluorescent lights. And then I said the words that shattered her world. "The Silver Pines HOA is legally defunct." Silence. Confused murmurs rippled through the crowd. I turned, addressing everyone. "This is the original charter that established the HOA. It clearly states that the governing authority expires after 20 years unless formally renewed by a majority homeowner vote." I glanced at Barbara, holding her stare. That renewal never happened. The board members froze. The room erupted. "Is that true? So we're not even in an HOA? She's been making up rules this whole time?" Barbara's mouth opened, closed, opened again. She was drowning. That's nonsense," she spat. "The board has continued its authority uninterrupted. There was no reason to hold a vote." "That's not how legal contracts work," I said. "There was a process, and you ignored it." The board scrambled, flipping through their notes, whispering amongst themselves. Then one of them, Mr. Lindell, the treasurer, looked up. His face was pale. "He's right," he muttered. Barbara snapped. "That doesn't change anything," she shouted. "The rules are still the rules." "No, Barbara," I said, stepping forward. "You have no rules. You have no power. You never did." Her face turned a deep shade of red. She turned to the board. "You're not going to let him get away with this. You know I've done what's best for this community." "The community?" Mrs. Patel cut in. "You've terrorized this place." "Barbara," another board member said, rubbing his temples. "We need to—" But she wasn't listening. She was spiraling. "This is a trick, a coup. This is a group of whiny, ungrateful—" Then a voice cut through the chaos. "You need to step down." It was Lindell. Barbara's head whipped around, so fast I thought she might snap her own neck. "Excuse me?" "You need to resign," he said firmly. Effective immediately. The entire room held its breath. Barbara's eyes darted around, searching for someone, anyone, to back her up. But the board members wouldn't even look at her. She was alone. "You can't do this," she whispered. "It's already done." Barbara was gone by the end of the week. She left behind a disgraced HOA, a shell of what it once was. The board dissolved. The fines were wiped out. The ridiculous rules, the checkpoints, the entire tyrannical empire collapsed overnight. Silver Pines was free. And as for me, I kept my house, camouflage and all. It became a landmark, a symbol. The house that ended the HOA tourists still stopped by to take pictures. Some even posed dramatically in front of it, pretending to search for the house that wasn't really there. And every time I saw someone laughing, I thought about Barbara, about how she wanted everything to blend in, to fit into her perfect little world. Instead, she became the only thing that disappeared.